Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Bach from UCAN. I'm the director of the triathlon business, and with me here is Bob Seebohar, the Olympic dietitian for the 2008 U.S. triathlon team in Beijing. Quite the athlete himself, and welcome back, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
I love our time together.
I do too. We just talk about some great stuff, don't we?
We do. So for today, I'm really excited about this one because it's really got a lot of good meaty stuff in here. This is episode number 2 of a 5-part series on fueling for triathlon. We went back to the basics in episode number 1. We learned what UCAN is, what metabolic efficiency training is, why they're important, why you might consider using them, and we learned how they can help you improve your performance. So today, we're going to talk about the how. How do you implement UCAN? How do you implement metabolic efficiency training? So how do people sort of incorporate UCAN into their training and their daily lives? We're going to focus very much on training and the implementation in sort of your day-to-day. And then in the next 2 episodes, we'll be speaking more on how do you incorporate it in your actual racing. So Bob, we'll start with you. How do you implement metabolic efficiency training? It dovetails very nicely into how to use UCAN. So we'll start with you. What are some of the foundational guidelines or rules of thumb when implementing metabolic efficiency training?
Yeah, I think it's important for all the listeners to understand first that metabolic efficiency training is more of a lifestyle change through nutrition. It's definitely not a diet, and there's not set macros or percentages or grams or anything like that. So it's really to kind of facilitate us moving through the lifestyle and aging correctly and going through different sports and possibly triathlon, short course or long course. So I've devised it as being actually very easy. And I hate to say that when it comes to nutrition, but I also love to say that because there's no counting involved. It's really just a matter of looking at carbohydrate, protein, and fat in your normal daily nutrition plan and trying to just pair up the ratios a little bit. And I know I said ratios, I'm not going to talk about numbers, but I love teaching what I've devised as what I call the hand model. So using the size of one hand, which is, as a definition, the hand is defined as your wrist to your fingertips. So it's the entire hand. So I love just teaching about having one hand of a protein source and then one hand is a carbohydrate source. Now, hopefully that carbohydrate source is more whole foods based, vegetables, fruits, maybe some whole grains, depending on if athletes are eating those or not, nuts, beans, and legumes. So it's actually quite easy and it's quite simple in the methodological implementation. Obviously, there's a behavior change component to it, but I'd like to be easy. I just, if we can kind of pair the hands in a 1-to-1 ratio, one hand carbohydrate to one hand protein, we know that is ideal blood sugar management from a lot of the research in nutrition and metabolism, even going up to a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 hands of carbohydrate to 1 hand of protein. So I like to just teach individuals and teach athletes how to navigate their food in terms of the proportion of carbohydrate to protein. You notice real quickly, I didn't talk about fat because most individuals who are not vegan have their fat sources in their protein-rich sources also. Now, vegans are a little bit special because their fats come in other places. But like I said, this is not a low-carb, high-fat diet. It's not a keto diet. It's a lifestyle change. So we really talk about the manipulation of blood sugar through the proper pairing of carbohydrate, protein, and fat.
That's really one of the things I loved about the approach is that it's a more balanced approach. It's not so extreme as something like keto.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not to say that it's a wrong approach for some people that works very, very well. But that's just what drew me to it, and how I found it to be kind of right for me is that it's very much a balanced approach. Even though metabolic efficiency training, keto, low carb, high fat are all sort of different methods of reaching fat adaptation. If you boil it down. So
yeah.
What about, do you recommend at different parts of your training having different amounts of carbohydrate? So for instance, like if you have a big day of training, do you have a higher ratio? Does it go higher than 2-to-1, or is it always sort of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, or tell me a little bit about that.
That's actually a great question. And in the triathlete market, so usually we've got short course, from the super sprint to the sprint distance, all the way up to the Ironman and even ultra Ironman these days. So there's a lot of different, I always look at the duration that an athlete is doing in their competition and thus their training. I also look at the intensity, or what I call the competitiveness of their training and racing. So as an example, obviously professional triathletes, their level of competitiveness is super high because it's their job compared to us recreational triathletes. So our level of competitiveness is much lower. While we're still competitive, it's definitely not the same in terms of the relative intensity. So once we know the duration and we know the intensity, then we can start looking at that periodization of carbohydrates and protein and fat, like you were saying, and if 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 is a little better. So what I'll always say is, it does certainly depend on the individual with their health goals, their body weight, body composition goals, and obviously their fitness and competitive goals. But in general terms, the 1-to-1 ratio, 1-to-1 carb to protein ratio does really well in the off season or the transition cycle, does really well like in the early prep, maybe even middle prep, maybe even late prep for some recreational athletes. That does really well because simply the body doesn't need that many carbohydrates because energy expenditure or caloric expenditure is a little bit less in those training cycles. And then to your point, as we start increasing the duration and or volume of our training, there will be certain times that our bodies do need more carbohydrates. However, here's one of the biggest mistakes triathletes make is they think, okay, I've got like a typical age grouper, they stack their weekend. Saturday, Sunday are the monster days. You've got a long bike, a long, run off the bike, long run on Saturday and Sunday. And so that's fantastic. But what they make the mistake in doing is they tend to not what I call microcycle periodize their program. So maybe Saturday and Sunday are big days, but maybe Monday's a day off. Maybe Tuesday's kind of light, and then they start building again for the weekend. So what's important, even if they're in their competitive or their build cycle, their training cycle, they're still going to be flopping back and forth between a 2-to-1 and 1-to-1, depending on what they're doing each day. And that's the biggest mistake I make the biggest mistake that triathletes make is that they're just simply overeating on days that they don't need to overeat. And then vice versa. Sometimes they're undereating on days that they should actually be eating a little bit more.
Makes sense. Now, more specifically, do you have some tips on very specifically how to implement metabolic efficiency training, like some of the different foods that you might say, don't eat this, but eat this instead, or, do you have some ideas there?
Yeah, it's, and I'll speak as non-vegans or vegetarians, because those are a little bit different bunch in terms of the foods that you usually recommend. In an endurance athlete, especially triathletes, daily nutrition plan. Notice I'm not saying diet, right? Daily nutrition plan. It's very important to identify protein sources first. So animal-based protein sources, obviously, again, not for the vegan or vegetarian, but those are cornerstone. And I only say they're the kind of the foundation of their eating plan, because those are most often overlooked and most often forgotten. In addition, they are the most robust macronutrient that actually stabilize and optimize blood sugar. So I always look to when I'm guiding my triathletes through their daily nutrition plan, we identify protein first. It doesn't mean they're eating a high protein diet. And in fact, quite the opposite, right? It just means we're going to put protein in our meals and snacks first so we don't forget them. So once we've got the proteins, it could be chicken, it could be fish, it can be beef. Then we build color around that. So you think color of the rainbow, right? So really quality vegetables, maybe starchy, maybe not so starchy, depending on how many carbohydrates they really need. And then kind of, depending on their training cycle, maybe we introduce some fruits, maybe you introduce some whole grains if more carbohydrates are needed. In general, though, I think a lot of triathletes, again, I think the norm is lower protein. They go for the carbs first, and usually it's the fruit and grains that are not whole grains. They're the refined grains. So those are things I'm a little more, not against, but I'm not too supportive of the refined processed starches specifically. And my mantra is to try to get some more anti-inflammatory foods, antioxidant-rich foods. So really thinking quality protein sources through animal-based products and color of the rainbow, but really trying to emphasize the veggies if we can at first. Obviously, way different for vegans and vegetarians. Maybe that's another webinar in the future.
Yeah, and one of the things, this is just you talking about how the carbs first, and it reminds me of back in high school, we'd have pasta parties before our 5K cross-country competitions, and that to me now it seems completely outrageous. I don't know where that all came
I
from.
know.
70s, old research, because I mean, really,
Exactly.
especially for a 5K, you've got plenty of stores on your body. You don't need to fuel. You don't need a carbo load before something like that. I mean, you really, the whole idea of carb loading in general has been essentially debunked at this point, is my understanding. So really, it's uh, it seems kind of almost comical at this point. But as far as
It
like
is.
how to implement it, I remember early on, um, never eat a carb alone was one of the sort of rules of thumb. So you
Mm-hmm.
may think that a piece of fruit is healthy, so you're good, but it's not necessarily the case. If you're eating a bowl of pineapple, it's very sugary and it is going to spike your blood sugar. So I know if you were to pair a smaller amount of that pineapple or maybe some berries, which have a lower glycemic response, with some protein, it'll really help to mitigate that blood sugar response and the insulin response, and therefore keep you in fat burning mode. And when you do that over and over again, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, you do that over and over again, that's what sort of essentially teaches your body to burn fat better, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I try to stay away from using the terms healthy and not healthy, or good and bad, because again, a lot of people do perceive fruits specifically as good. And I'm not saying they're not good, but what I'm trying to teach athletes is that we're actually talking about blood sugar management. We're not talking about good or bad foods unless there's a specific medical condition that we're introducing. And obviously that's not the topic here that we're talking about. So if we're looking at blood sugar management and optimization, you are spot on. Like, we don't want to pair just a carbohydrate by itself. And that's I think another huge mistake that triathletes are making, especially because there is so much information, false information out there that's feeding in from the media and the internet.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about in the last one was I think I mentioned something about eating like burgers and bacon, and these things are okay, like cheese and things like that. You can
Yep.
incorporate that into your metabolic efficiency training approach, because it's not a diet, it's a way of eating where you're trying to keep blood sugar stable. So
Exactly.
one thing also that I did early on was, instead of having peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which were my go-to, I would have 2 to 3 of
Yeah.
those before like every morning for breakfast and then sometimes for lunch. Instead of that, I made a fairly simple change to that, having just one slice of bread, whole grain bread or whole wheat bread, with a thick layer of peanut butter on it and chia seeds or pumpkin seeds on it, instead of having that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So for me, I still
That's
got
a
my peanut
great
butter
idea.
fix, but I
Yep.
didn't have to overload with all the sugar from the jam or the extra carbohydrates from the bread, and felt great when I was out training. So it sat really well with me.
Absolutely. Well, and,
Sometimes I would
and
have
let
Greek
me,
yogurt and fruit or pumpkin seeds with that, or
yeah,
sometimes eggs and bacon.
I was just going to say the same thing, Matt, where I think so many, and again, I work with a lot of triathletes, right? And I always do food logs. And what I'm seeing still, and this is like, I used to eat oatmeal like it was going out of style like 15, 20 years ago. Like, that's what endurance athletes did, right? But here's what I'm still seeing triathletes do this. Here's the real interesting thing though. So oatmeal, unless you really doctor it up, and now I did this like super oatmeal where I had to add so much stuff just to control blood sugar. But here's the thing, we can get the same response that we need in terms of carbohydrates and protein and fat and everything if, and you mentioned the Greek yogurt, plain Greek yogurt, mixing it in with peanut butter, and not a lot of people like doing that because they need some texture to it. So if you put some cocoa nibs, you put some hemp seeds, chia seeds are not as crunchy, but my point is this: you can really easily change a breakfast like an oatmeal to still
Mhm.
satisfy your energy needs while still supporting blood sugar. It is really, like, I hate to say it, but it is really as easy as that.
Hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a not so good version of oatmeal that will spike your blood sugar, and then there's a version of oatmeal that will not spike your blood sugar, right? So like if you add a bunch of
Absolutely.
uh, brown sugar and uh, other sugary things like craisins or raisins or something into
Yeah.
there, it's gonna spike it. But if you're putting nuts and you're putting seeds and things like that, then it's
Yes.
gonna turn it into a very good stable type of meal. So tell me, I think you
Exactly.
mentioned very briefly last time about misses. So just tell me
Mhm.
very quickly about, like, what is a miss in metabolic efficiency
Yeah.
training and why are they important?
Yeah. Absolutely. So we look at, food in general, we look at three different categories of macronutrients, right? We look at carbohydrates, which are fruits, they're vegetables, they're grains, they're seeds, they're nuts. We look at protein, obviously, like we talked about, animal-based sources such as dairy products, cheeses, milks. We're looking still at like some nuts and seeds have protein, and there's actually a lot of foods that have protein, but beef, chicken, fish, pork. And then we look at whole grains, and those are really like the true whole grains. So what isn't included in there are those little, again, I call them misses. So the occasional miss, and I have this saying, minimize the misses, but these could be things like your potato chips, like your chocolate, your traditional simple sugar sport drinks or gels. Like these are all misses.
Or
And
beer.
they're beer, alcohol, absolutely. You go
Those
out
are my
Friday night
favorite
with
misses.
the guys, yeah. But here's the thing that people don't understand: if you just try to, like, the whole goal here is to try to minimize the misses. It's not try to eradicate and completely eliminate the misses, because misses are actually necessary to develop a healthy relationship with food. And think about this, like think about your favorite miss. And if I told you you can never have that again in your life for no other reason than we think it's not great for you, then you're going to want it even more, right? So that there's a little psychological component there. But what I'm saying is we actually have to list our misses. We have to know what our misses are, but we also have to know why we're consuming those misses. Like, but not to validate them, just to say, hey, if I'm going to have a beer, I'm going to have a beer. It's no big deal. I'm not a bad person. It's part of my lifestyle, nutrition, metabolic efficiency training plan. So it's very important to recognize that.
Now, this dovetails really well into UCAN because the foundational idea of keeping blood sugar stable and managing blood sugar, really that's what UCAN does. It manages your blood sugar. It doesn't give you that blood sugar spike and crash effect. It gives you a stable release. So the formats and flavors, I guess we'll talk a little bit about how you use UCAN in your training and in your daily life. So to give you a sense of what UCAN is, like how it's offered, there are three different product lines. Super starch powders, which are labeled as performance energy. And those are powders that you mix in usually water, but for some of, especially the post-workout recovery drinks, people like to use milk or almond milk. And consider that your fuel. That's your liquid food. And I say food because it is actually a food. It's FDA regulated, FDA approved. So it's not a supplement like many of the other sports nutrition products that are out there, which are largely unregulated, not nearly as regulated as FDA is. And they come in lemon, cran, raspberry, and orange flavors. There are also vanilla and chocolate flavors that have protein added. And then there's a plain, I guess you can't really call it a flavor, but it's plain. So by itself, I'm not going to lie, it's not great. It's like chalky water, but it's really intended to be mixed with other things. And we'll get into that a little bit, especially in the last webinar in this series, which will be about some tips and tricks, sort of your UCAN 201 on how to use UCAN. The bars, they also have super starch in them, so you'll have that long-lasting steady energy. They're simply open and eat, easy as that, and they come in chocolate peanut butter, cinnamon, and coffee. And Hydrate, as the name suggests, it's for hydration. So it's a powder that's mixed with water, 0 calories and 0 sugar, and it comes in berry, watermelon, and lemon lime flavors. And as far as how you use it in your training, right, this episode is focused on the how. I'm going to start with the super starch powders. So first thing to know is that a little bit goes a long way with the super starch. So the effect of it, or the release of energy, is, as Bob has mentioned, is almost like a seeping of energy into your system. It's a steady release, and so that is more effective and more efficient. You don't get that spike and crash. So a little bit goes a long way. In my own experience, I used to target around 300 calories an hour of sugary stuff, and I was unable to get in that much because of bonking and GI distress issues. And so I only ended up having something like 230 calories an hour. But then once I started using UCAN, I only took in 94 calories an hour, that paired with metabolic efficiency training. Only 94 calories an hour at Ironman Maryland when I won that race, and then 68 calories an hour in Kona 2015. And that happened to be a bit too low for me, I discovered, but a little bit goes a long way. So most people find they don't need to have nearly as much And as far as dosing, you'll kind of get a picture of what I mean, because dosing, you have one serving approximately every 90 minutes. Now, from a calorie standpoint, that's 120 calories for one serving. For 90 minutes, that's only 80 calories an hour. So that's on the low end, but that typically works for a lot of people during their training, especially. During racing, it might be a bit higher because of your higher energy output, but we can go into that in the next episode where we start talking about the racing. So one serving per 90 minutes. If you're going to be doing a workout that's less than 2 hours, if you have a serving of UCAN, you can do essentially a preload by having one serving of UCAN before you go out, let's say about 20 to 30 minutes before you go out. And then you do your swim, your bike, or your run up to 2 hours without having to have anything else. You just have your body fat stores and UCAN, the one serving that gets you through the whole way. So it's kind of handy because you can go out for an hour and 45-minute long run, let's say, and not have to carry any fuel with you. If it's hot, you might want to be carrying some water and electrolytes, but at least you don't have to worry about carrying fuel. If you're doing something that's longer than 2 hours, you're going to want to have a serving every 90 minutes, approximately. Now, everybody's different, so it might be one serving every hour. It might be a serving every 2 hours. Everybody's a little different. That's where you have your training, so you can test that out. As far as concentration, you can't really go wrong with UCAN. You can mix one serving in 3 ounces of water, and it becomes very thick and pasty, almost like a gel. Or you can mix it all the way up to a serving in 20 ounces of water, let's say, and then it just becomes a lot smoother and a lot more dilute. It just means you have to drink that much more fluid in order to get in your calories. Most people tend to gravitate somewhere in between, maybe one serving every 10 ounces. The protein enhanced versions were created for recovery. It's super starch, but it has whey protein added, and that's great for post-workout. Most people mix it with almond milk because it's delicious that way. But many people use it pre or during because it adds to satiety. So I use it sometimes when I know I'm going out for a 4 or 5 hour long bike ride or brick workout because I don't want to get hungry at hour 3, 4, 5. I want to feel like I'm not hungry, right, the whole time. So that protein that's in there tends to satiate a little bit better than just a pure carbohydrate like super starch. Some tips on mixing. Try mixing the night before, mixing up your bottles the night before, and sticking it in the fridge. It tends to be a better consistency if you do it that way. Also, always use water first and then the powder, which is a pretty basic trick, but most people, or some people mess that up. Most people are pretty familiar with that though, because protein shakes, you'd never go powder first and then water. It just kind of clumps at the bottom. And when you do shake it, if you shake it in a mixer with a wire ball, like the ones that we sell on our website, they're the UCAN blender bottles. It has a nice wire ball in there that helps mix up the powder so that it becomes smoother. The bars are great substitutes for the powders. So if you like to have something to chew, you can bring the bars out on the bike. They work particularly well on the bike because you just stuff them in the back of your jersey. And the cinnamon and the coffee bars do not have a chocolate coating on them. The chocolate and the chocolate peanut butter bars do. And the reason why that matters is because the chocolate peanut butter bars with that chocolate coating, when it gets hot out, it gets very melty, and nobody wants that melty mess. So take the cinnamon bars and the coffee bars out when it's above about 75 or 75 degrees. And those one bar will last you 60 to 90 minutes. So it tends to be a pretty good substitute for the servings of the powders. And finally, the third product category is Hydrate. UCAN Hydrate. People love bringing it on the bike. Maybe they have it on the pool deck. Maybe they stash a bottle, on their run along the way, or maybe just at a point that they circle back on. And people just sip it throughout the day as well. So the steady energy that you get from UCAN is valuable also for your daily life. Typically the goals here for UCAN products are steady energy and hydration from the UCAN Hydrate products. And those are things that people want in their daily life, not just in their training, but people will sip on UCAN Hydrate throughout the day to replenish what they have lost in their sweat. And the bars I snack on sometimes just to get me through my workday. And the powders have a meal replacement shake. Actually, I did that just yesterday. I had a whole milk with 2 servings of the vanilla performance energy, and that was my lunch yesterday. So it's great for like the average human looking for a healthier way to energize themselves, and it's ultimately super starch, we imagine, will be used very much by people with diabetes type 1 and type 2. Bob, any things to add on sort of the UCAN side of things and how to implement it or how you've implemented it before?
Yeah, I mean, I concur with everything you said. I would just encourage people to think outside the sport nutrition window, which I do with all my triathlete clients, is this isn't just a sport nutrition product. And you touched on it towards the end. This is a product. If you get that traditional, 2 to 4 p.m. crash where you're seeking sugar, caffeine, like there's a reason. Obviously, your daily nutrition plan isn't optimizing blood sugar, but to get over that's actually where I end up using UCAN quite a bit with my athletes, is because it's a very sensitive window, because you're very predicated to choose a simple sugar-based product to feel better. But I would just throw that out there. I would say, experiment with it in your daily nutrition. You don't have to use it as your crutch, but I would definitely start utilizing it or trying it in that afternoon to kind of get you in between the lunch and the dinner, maybe even as an afternoon snack. It works wonders in between that specific time period. In addition to everything you said, on the bike or run or preloading, all of that is absolutely valid. But I just like to explore the other opportunities with athletes also.
Great. And anything else to add before we close out for this episode?
I don't think so. I think we're going to get into a lot of different ways to use it in the next one, which is always a great thing. And as we know, there's some creative ways to use UCAN. But I would just piggyback on what you said, where the biggest thing is, another big mistake I see triathletes making is if they move over from a simple sugar-based product to Generation UCAN, they think the dosing is similar, and it's not. Just like you said, I mean, I usually dose it 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the athlete and the distance and the intensity they're doing for that session or the race. So keep in mind that you don't have to start pushing in, every 15, 20 minutes like you do for a simple sugar-based product. And that's, again, one of the biggest mistakes I think a lot of triathletes make. And then they tend to over-consume, and it just doesn't work out that well. So definitely utilize it in that 60 to 90 minute window time.
Yeah, one of those things that I've found, and that many of the athletes that I've talked to about their UCAN usage, is that because a little bit goes a long way, and because when you get back from your workouts, you don't feel ravenously hungry reaching for everything in the fridge because your blood sugar is stable. Like, what causes you to have all that hunger is this drop in blood sugar. So if you don't have that, then you come back and you can actually make a smart decision about the things that you want to eat. And it helps with body composition. So the end result there is that you're gonna lean out, you're gonna burn away the fat, and you're gonna keep the lean muscle that you want to help propel you to your PRs. So the next two episodes will focus on racing using UCAN and metabolic efficiency training, and we're gonna break that out into different distances. So the next episode will focus on short course, sprint and Olympic distances. And then the fourth episode will focus on long course triathlon, 70.3 and Ironman distance. And each one will provide you with some specific race nutrition plans that you might try. So thank you, Bob. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.